NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We want to first start off by welcoming you to today's webinar, and thank you for joining. Today's discussion is going to be on legislating freedom, the importance of a second look. My name is Monica Reed. I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Advocacy here at the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. As you may know, organizations from around the country come together in April to celebrate Second Chance Month, joining forces to help raise awareness about the collateral consequences that those with a felony conviction face. NACDL kicked off its Second Chance Month programming with a virtual discussion on second chance stories, highlighting our Return to Freedom project, several individuals who were released from long periods of incarceration, and their pro bono attorneys who were paired through the project. Today's webinar is the second in our virtual programming for the month, and we're excited to be partnering with our long-term partner and ally, the Sentencing Project, on the topic of second look sentencing reform. So today's conversation is going to delve into the country's sort of continued over-reliance on incarceration and extreme sentences and the harm they cause, while highlighting the importance of second look legislation. We are joined today by Alexandra Bailey. She is the end-of-life imprisonment strategist for the Sentencing Project. It is she that will be moderating today's panel discussion, and she is going to further introduce her co-panelists as well. Before I turn over to Alexandra, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. So one, we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat. You can include your name, your organization, where you're from. We anticipate a very robust conversation today, and so we encourage you to put any questions you want to address to the panelists in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. After sort of the moderated panel portion, our panelists will turn to the audience questions to address those as well. We do apologize in advance if we can't get to all the questions, but we will be sharing the panelists' contact information toward the end of today's conversation. And lastly, I just want to take a minute to highlight our code of conduct for affiliated persons, and this applies to all attendees of our programming, including virtual events. We shared the code with everyone who registered for today's program, and we will drop a link in the chat as well. But to summarize, we at NACDL, we endeavor to foster an environment that is free of harassment, discrimination, intimidation, and insult, and this includes any offensive remarks, comments, or questions. Unfortunately, if it's determined that any attendee has violated this code while participating in today's webinar, we will remove you from the session today. And lastly, but not least, I want to highlight the importance of language, especially as it relates to those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And I ask that you refrain from using any dehumanizing language when referring to individuals who are formerly incarcerated, and really use language that restores dignity and humanity to those who are directly impacted by our criminal legal system. With that, I'm going to turn over to Alexandra, who's going to continue today's panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Monica. And again, thank you so much to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers for this invitation. The Sentencing Project is thrilled to take part. My name is Alexandra Bailey. I lead the campaign strategy for the Sentencing Project's campaign to end life imprisonment, and I am very thrilled to be leading this panel. And I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, actually. So when I call your name, if you would just say your organization, your pronouns, and what brings you here today. Eric, we'll kick off with you.
Eric Alexander, pronouns he, him. My organization is the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. Life without the possibility of parole for children brings me here to the issue today.
Wonderful. Kate.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Mogilescu. My pronouns are she and her. I direct the Defender Clinic at Brooklyn Law School and the Survivors Justice Project in New York. And I am here, I think, to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in New York around the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which is and is not a second look act. And I think we'll be kind of going through that in our discussion today. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Warren.
Hello, my name is Warren Allen. My pronouns are he and him. I'm an in life imprisonment campaign fellow with the Sentencing Project. Also, I'm a recipient of a second look here in Washington, D.C., called the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act. And what brings me here is the importance of individuals like myself receiving a second look and how I can spearhead the movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Lawanda.
Hello, I'm Luanda Hollister. I am formerly incarcerated, and my organizations are American Friends Service Committee and Nation Outside.
Thank you all so much for joining us. So let's dive right in. We are at the 5-year anniversary of Second Chance Month, and you all spend all year long 365 on these issues. So if you just start out by telling us what your organization has been focusing on in 21 and 22. Eric, I guess I'll pick on you again to start.
No problem. 2021 and the start of 2022 have been quite busy for me and the CFSY team. I've personally been involved in legislative campaigns to abolish life without the possibility of parole for children in Wisconsin, New Mexico, Rhode Island, Indiana, and Tennessee, and also building relationships with prosecuting attorneys in southern states. We work to build bipartisan support for these reforms in these states. Though we were not able to see our bills move this session, we will look forward to the next session. I also had the pleasure of welcoming home Mr. Henry Montgomery, spending time with him and Brian Stevenson down at the National Museum for Peace and Justice, which is located in Montgomery, Alabama. For those who are not aware of Henry Montgomery, his case was Montgomery versus Alabama, which provided retroactive relief to children sentenced to life without parole. So that's what I've been up to.
Slacking off, I see. Kate?
Yes, thank you. So at the Survivors Justice Project, as I mentioned, we have spent the last 3 years now, almost, seeing in the implementation of a new law in New York State, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which has 2 pieces to it. But for purposes of our discussion today, the piece that we'll be looking at and weighing benefits and sort of disadvantages and obstacles that we faced is a resentencing piece for survivors of domestic violence who are serving sentences of 8 years or more on almost all, but not all offenses in New York, which again, I think is something we'll talk about. If they can show that their offense was caused, at least in part, by their experience with domestic violence, family abuse, sexual exploitation. So we have been trying to implement this law, get folks that work in the criminal legal system trained up, make sure that people on the inside understand what the law is, what the process is, how to connect with resources and counsel. And just as a quick update, we have had 24 people resentenced in New York State under this law so far, saving collectively 50 years of incarceration. If those same people had been sentenced under the guidelines that this law allows initially, would have avoided over 165 years of incarceration. So there's some very dramatic things that are happening, but I can't wait for this discussion to talk about kind of the ins and outs of that and how the work that we are doing ties into that which the other panelists are working on in the Sentencing Project and NACDL. Thanks.
Fabulous. Lawanda, how have you been doing 2021 and 2022?
I've been doing just fine, Alex. I am really a part of this work because of my release from incarceration after 34 years and the re-entry issues that I had once I received a second look. And that is what started me to doing this work, so that others who receive the second look won't have to go through the same struggles and barriers that I had to go through. So 21 and 22 have been my first 2 years home, and this is what I have been doing in its entirety.
And it's been fabulous to work with you. And Warren.
Yes, hello. 2021 and 22, has been quick for me. I'm a new father, and certain things like that, propelled me to embrace life a little quicker. But since I've been here with the Sentencing Project, my main focus is to end extreme sentences and help with the second look legislation in all states. That is how, I focus. That is how I prepare, for individuals like myself that's coming behind me to receive the same adequate treatment and things of that nature, I've received since I've been released. It's not easy, it's work, but I'm up for the task.
Absolutely. So why don't we get into the meat of this? Everybody here has been working on legislation that to some extent allows for a second chance, but this legislation is not easy. It comes with very difficult negotiations at the legislative levels. It comes with even further difficulty when it comes to actual implementation. So, Kate, why don't I just circle back to you, since you really start to touch on that. You created a law for domestic violence survivors, which covered, as you said, not everybody. So can we talk first a little bit about that? And when you passed this law, what difficulty are you seeing in actually getting people the justice they deserve?
Yeah, thank you. And when you say you, Alex, of course, what you're referring to is a decade-long struggle from the Coalition for Women Prisoners in New York.
Absolutely, yes.
So the effort for the passage of this law, I mean, the origin story of this law actually dates back to 1985 and to a hearing that took place at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, the Women's Max facility in New York, where women on the inside testified to public officials who came in about the sort of experiences they had, the role of domestic violence in their lives. Fast forward, 2009, the Coalition for Women Prisoners picks up the effort again to think, okay, what kind of legislation can we develop, can we create to address some of these extreme sentences for survivors of domestic violence? That led to a 10-year campaign spearheaded by the coalition, with lots of legislative obstacles, lots of back and forth compromise conversations that many of us have had in different ways. And then the law was finally passed in 2019. So the U here is a very, very big, very, very big U. And then the carve-outs, the exclusions in the law are something that we continue to return to day in and day out. So the law applies to violent felony offenses, or as we say, offenses that are classified as violent in New York state law, because there is a distinction. And it applies to almost all homicide offenses, and then lesser included or lower offenses. It does not apply to our murder in the first degree in New York state, which is one of the charges for which you actually can be sentenced to life without parole. So that is an issue. Right? There are people in New York state who are serving life without sentences that are not able to seek relief under this law. The law also excludes anyone convicted of a terrorist offense or an offense that's classified as a sex offense that requires registration. So those are the exceptions. And right away, we knew all along, but right away it became clear that that's a problem. The other issue that I think is worth raising just from the very beginning is that why I said this is a second look act and is not. Second look, and it allows us to go back and sort of make a case why someone's sentence should be reduced. But the definition, the eligibility, is centered around an experience with domestic violence that might not apply to everyone who needs a sentence reduction. There's a sort of more narrow understanding of this only applies to people who have experienced domestic violence, and the domestic violence has to have been happening at the time of the offense and be a significant contributing factor to the offense. So that too tends to limit who might be able to even seek a sentence reduction under the law. And then I think we can get into later of what the process actually is like and how much we ask of people who are seeking a sentence reduction and sort of how that has been set up. But I think I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, absolutely. We write laws, but then actually the implementation and the bars that people who are currently incarcerated are asked to clear, and the level of judgment that comes down upon them in the most terrible of circumstances, is something we definitely need to look at. Warren, as a recipient of an actual second look under the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, tell us a little bit about what was actually taken into consideration for you in achieving your second look. What did the judge consider?
Great question. Well, from my experience, standing in front of the judge, The judge didn't take into high consideration my infraction history, which included me being served with a 200 serious infraction for having an extra blanket to avoid being sick. He more so paid attention to my mentoring. Did I educate and program? And if there was adequate services provided at the institution. He paid attention to things like how I helped stop the riot. He also took into high consideration the risk assessment specialist opinion, on my behavior, previously and futuristically. Those were some of the important things that the judges paid attention to. And here in the nation's capital, it's more of a cohesive movement with these type of approaches to second look sentences. So, them were the things that was taken into high consideration, again, posed to an individual's infraction history, which almost is inevitable on the inside, just more of the healthy rehabilitative qualities.
Absolutely. Eric, you've been fighting for people who are juveniles, just as Warren was, and you, to my understanding, have been not willing to compromise on carve-outs and including all young people in the bills that you've been fighting for. Would you talk a little bit more about why it is you feel that second look bills or the repeal of life without parole bills have to stay fully inclusive?
Well, I'll say this, we believe that advocating for the abolition of life without parole and other extreme sentences for children is a catalyst for broader reform. We've seen this in DC. For example, that our bill there, which impacted all children under 18, was subsequently expanded by other advocates to provide relief for the emerging adult population. Second chance advocacy requires an array of strategies, and we believe that our work is one piece that can spur and serve as a complement to other reform efforts.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lawanda, you too are a recipient of a second look and lived through some of the most brutal times for women in Michigan's carceral history. What did it mean for you to be able to receive a second look, and what did that entail for you? What was taken into consideration?
Well, they mainly considered behavior because I went through the regular parole process, which here in Michigan is extremely vigorous, to say the least. However, the things that they looked at, they did consider my behavior inside the institution. They considered my victims, and just mainly if, in fact, they really, in my opinion, had no true sense of how to say that a person has changed or is doing other than by the things that I had done. And those are the things that they took into consideration to promote my release, which they granted because actually my tail was 60 years, so they could have denied me for another 30.
Wow, that's terrible. So let's circle back just a little bit when it comes to what we haven't achieved in laws and what we need to sort of go back and revisit, the primary problem that we see with these exclusions. And what that actually means. So Kate, I'll turn back to you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, again, in New York, we don't have a second look law. So people who are serving extreme sentences have to navigate the parole experience that Lawanda was just describing in a way that, I mean, we could have a whole other discussion about all of the problems inherent in our parole system. That would take too much time for this answer, but we just we do not have a way for people to get back into court after serving a long period of time right now and seek a sentence reduction. And that is a huge problem. So as Eric says, with the campaign to end, life imprisonment for young people, we see the domestic violence law as a way to continue and push forward right? And educate about the harm of long-term sentences, of extreme sentences. So although we are confronting all of the obstacles of the exclusions and the more limited nature of our law, it is what we have on the books right now. So it is what we are using. Look at that cat. So I think, I mean, the question, the problem is when we get into what charges should count, what charges don't count, we're reduced to this very simplistic view, right? Where anyone who set foot in a courthouse for more than 1 second knows that all of that is arbitrary. The fact that you can be arrested for one charge, indicted on another charge, sentenced on another, all depends on the particular alignment of the stars at that moment, what DA you had, what prosecutor you had, what judge you were in front of, what, you know, all of these things that actually don't give an indication of what occurred, of any harm that did occur. And then, of course, what a person has done in the many, many, many years since. And one other issue just to flag, which I don't know if we'll be able to talk about today, is just this sort of also this, the narratives that people have to generate in order to qualify for a second chance, a second look. And the standards that we set, you know, we're now also conditioning, I think, judges and prosecutors to expect a tale of redemption, right? And the TV movie version of it, not the reality of just some of the ups and downs of life for people on the inside, people on the outside. And that therefore, if you're not, you know, if you haven't gotten your college degree, have a flawless disciplinary record, you know, all the things that, then what? Then what? And so I worry about the standards that we set up also in that. But I think, again, I would be really interested in hearing other panelists' thoughts on that.
Well, Lawanda, you want to jump in on the standards, please? I see you.
Yes, I wanted to say, because Kate mentioned that the process of like appeals and things like that, the state Michigan doesn't recognize that if you don't know what you don't know, you just don't know it. So therefore, what that means is that after they help you with that first appeal, then you're on your own for the rest of your time. So during my 34 years, I had exhausted every appeal, everything. And so there was nothing else that I could do other than serve 40 years to be released because I had exhausted everything else. And is vigorous, as I said, for the things that they put you through in order, you know, to determine what it is. Had you changed from what I had done at the age of 17, and now I'm 52.
Exclusions definitely present a massive problem. Eric, do you want to speak to this at all?
You know, because we work on the issue of life without parole for children, we try not to exclude, you know, any child from that bill, because we recognize the trauma and, you know, other things that go into, you know, children who commit these type of crimes. So, you know, when it comes to, exclusions, we try to stay away from excluding any child because we believe that all children deserve second chances.
And when it comes to the standard or the bar that they must clear in order to gain their release, what are your feelings about how we standardize who is worthy and who is not?
Come back to me on that. I'm sorry.
Well, Warren, I'll turn to you on that one.
Well, you know, I say, you know, the mitigating circumstances is vital. You know, an individual's pre-incarceration circumstances is very, very vital to one's incarceration. Environment plays a heavy part in that as well. Household, heedless risk-taking, things of that nature. You know, for an individual who come up, you know, impoverished, I was truly a victim of my environment. And then going to the inside, you know, I was just more so incapacitated. to the point to where as though, I had to find wholesome and healthy ways to help myself, without certain things being provided. It's there, but it's a system within the system. What I mean by that, the staff have a system they go by, and as residents, we have a system that we go by. And it's kind of uncool to do the cool thing in prison. So, one would have to step outside of his comfort zone, just to educate himself, go to religious service and things of that nature. And, without being looked at as a sellout. I say if, those who are on the inside, find, ways to, educate and program and things of that nature, yes, you should do it. But however, everyone is not doing it, due to what I just previously explained, by, just having this toxic masculinity and being involved with certain gangs and things of that nature that don't, look up to healthy and wholesome ideas and so things to help individuals get released from prison a little faster. In closing, I say here in the nation's capital, a lot of my IRA returnees, my brothers, like 95% of us had shots, detrimental shots, things of that nature. If that was more so the standard, none of us would be free. None of us would be free. So it takes a more, clinical and analytical approach, to one's incarceration environment, again. But however, for me to be free today to speak of something so significant, I'm more than honored to speak about it.
Well, Warren, I think you said something very important about mitigating circumstances, right? It's very hard to standardize when trauma is not standard. The trauma prior to incarceration and the trauma during incarceration. And then, of course, there's a massive variance of that depending on gender orientation and age. Eric, how are you encouraging people to look at things differently, right? Because we had this sort of 18 cutoff, right, for a long time. And with the second look bill, there was this expansion to 25 under this concept of the emerging adult, where we're starting to understand more about the brain and more about trauma. How has that been impacting your work in the juvenile space?
We've seen a huge shift in the sentencing laws for children facing life without parole. In a little over a decade, more than half the country has banned sentencing children to life without parole in either law or practice. Most of the states that have enacted these reforms have done so with bipartisan support, often with support from faith communities and business communities. We continue to face challenges. One of the challenges is a lack of education and awareness. Often legislators and their constituents don't know that children are allowed to be sentenced to life without parole in their state. Another challenge that our work focuses on children charged with the most serious crimes. It could be a challenge to shift the paradigm around youth who commit harm and encourage decision makers to understand that we are all more than the worst thing that we've ever done, especially children.
Lawanda, please jump on in.
As a juvenile offender, I always try to play like the devil's advocate, because people are like, oh, well, they committed the crime. That old saying, can't do the time, don't do the crime, and all that type of stuff. Well, they are now realizing, you have a term, and I always forget it, about the age, the age thing. What is that? Tell me, Alex. Tell me, what is it? The age thing, the scientists.
Emerging adults, yes.
Yes. Okay. So as a juvenile, I can, speak for me. And now the scientists are saying it involves all children. Because when I said it, people were like, oh, whatever. I knew right from wrong. Yes, I did. However, I had no understanding whatsoever, could not even begin to mentally think of consequences. And so coupled that with the crime, at what point do I get to overcome that? And Warren said about circumstances and things like that. I grew up poor, but I didn't know I was poor. I didn't know I was poor until they told me after I was incarcerated, you were poor. I didn't know that. I didn't come up like that. So I didn't have them circumstances. Mine was a difference in right from wrong. I chose wrong. And eventually I grew up to understand what the wrong was. And thank God for the second chance. Because I don't want people to say, oh, now y'all just want to let everybody out of prison and this, that, and the other. I believe that we are trying to go forward with this because of those scientists and things like that. And those rulings. Go ahead, Alex, I see you.
No, I was about to say, I just want to touch on something that you said that I think is sort of very important, which I think comes down to perpetual punishment, right? You know, you made a mistake at one point, you know, and then does that mean that the rest of your life cannot be regained, that you are not worthy of that second chance? And so I want to turn our attention to sort of a conversation that when it comes to legislation, writing legislation, either in the juvenile or the adult space, or in any sort of wedge that we're trying to drive in, for example, DVSJA, to get at extreme sentencing, there's a lot of conversation about these carve-outs. And it's contentious, even amongst coalitions, as well as amongst legislators. And there's this sort of range of opinions, as we said, not just about the bar that people have to clear, but about who can be redeemed and who can't. And we bring that down to a criminal code, right? When it comes to what you would actually like legislators and others to consider, if you had your dream world on this law, what would you actually want the deciding factors to be? Kate, we'll start with you.
I mean, many of us have already suggested some things, you know, when Warren talks about the mitigating circumstances and how critical that is, a broad and real understanding of what mitigation can be. You know, when someone is prosecuted, there's such an intense focus on the immediate offense, right? Seconds before, seconds after, right? And there's not an ability to zoom out and understand exactly what we've been talking about, what people may have been through before, what their experience has been. And there's also a lot of harm that comes in the prosecution itself that then dictates what happens next. So the harms of labeling, the way the criminal legal process plays out, the way people are silenced, further marginalized as someone being prosecuted for a crime. And then, as LaWanda says, right, then you're sentenced and expected to sort of switch gears right away, go through your appeals. Get ready for your appeals and understand the law and know what you're supposed to appeal and how you're supposed to do it, right? And through that whole time, though, there is not any kind of attempt at an honest reckoning with who you are, what has happened to you, what you have done, right? That's all taken out of the picture. So maybe my hope, as optimistic and crazy as it sounds, is that some of that can come back into the picture through these kinds of laws. So that, you know, for years you're told, don't say anything, don't admit you did anything wrong, and just sit there and let this play out. And particularly as a young person or even an adult, right? That is harmful. There is harm happening there. And then you're sentenced to a sentence that you don't know if you're going to make it to the end of, right? And you have to adjust your brain for that. And then you're still hopeful, though, maybe a direct appeal is going to do something. Maybe something's going to change. And that doesn't happen. Right? And then you move on. Maybe I'll seek clemency. At least in New York, people still think they might get clemency, even though there's no indication that anyone's getting clemency anytime soon. Right? And you go through that process. And at each step, you're sort of forced to be reduced to this small little portion of yourself, not your whole self. And how do we get some supports in place, some real conversation about who people are beyond just what was in the indictment, however many years ago, or what the parole board's going to focus on? So I don't know, how do you codify that into a law? How do you write that? Beats me.
I think that's the challenge we're all dealing with. I think that's the struggle that we're all in, and then how you implement that. Eric?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. I really appreciate what you just shared. I'll only add that we should be asking for reform that centers trauma and victimization as key considerations in front-end sentencing and back-end reviews. For those under 18, we should be asking for sentencing that is age appropriate, includes treatment as well as restorative practice. And, wholesale, we have to abolish the sentence of life without parole for those under the age of 18.
Well, the sentencing project, we want it gone for everyone, but definitely for those under the age of 18. Warren, I can see your face, and I feel like you have a response sort of brewing there around about what you would actually like to be considered, given the fact that this is something you've gone through.
Some powerful replies to the question. I just like to say that children shouldn't be held culpable to the same extent as adults. See, once you view a child as an adult, that's the first failure, because children have more time to change and grow and unfold into new and better things. And back to what I said initially, if you understood an individual's pre-incarceration circumstance, that would kind of give you a scope on how to view this person. Where did you actually go wrong at? How can we help you? But the system just incarcerate hurt people into another system that doesn't do anything to justify the harm. So I like to say that my initial thoughts is for children not to be held culpable to the same extent as adults, because children are more subject, for change than anything else.
Absolutely. So I want to have a talk about sort of these lines that are drawn about who gets a second chance. So there was the conversation about the sub 18, right, that we classified as juveniles. Then we moved that up to 25 in the emerging adult scheme. But one of the things that we know at the Sentencing Project through our Women and Girls report is that the rate of incarcerated women has jumped significantly by 1980. But what we also know is that the age of those offenses is usually higher than the emerging adult sort of spectrum, right? And Kate, you're sort of dealing with this, and often women and what they specifically experience both in life, in trauma, in how they are sentenced and how they are incarcerated is often very much left out of how we think about the legislation that we're going to pass. And I know, Kate, and I'll turn this to you, when you all were working on DVSJA, you had very significant directly impacted female leadership that was very specific about how they were going to go about carve-outs and a multitude of things. Can you speak to that a little?
Sure. And I should say, the efforts of the Coalition of Women Prisoners over time have now sort of transformed into the efforts of the Survivors Justice Project, which I am a part of. And again, when you ask, and one of my answers to your question about how to draft the right legislation should have obviously been, well, you think about who's drafting and who's at the table for that. And that our process in New York, I think, teaches us some lessons that when the idea for legislation, the impetus comes from people who are actually suffering from the worst consequences of the harmful practice you're trying to change, that's where you get movement, right? Like that is where you actually have power. And so where we are now, to answer your question, Survivors Justice Project continues to be led by it's a collective. We are an interdisciplinary collective. We are researchers, students, activists, lawyers, social workers, but many of us are formerly incarcerated, have survived not just long-term incarceration, but also domestic violence. So, right, the connections that you mentioned, Alex, between the increasing rate of incarceration of women in this country and long-term sentencing, the extreme sentencing, the Sentencing Project just did another report on very recently, and the way in which women's experiences, I mean, we talk about how mitigating circumstances aren't considered. They're considered even less so for women, right? Because so much of what women experience doesn't come to the surface. Abuse that happens in a home, right, or privately, that is not made part of those mitigating circumstances that we need to understand about someone when they are arrested and charged with an offense. So women's experience is under-researched, misunderstood, and even though the number of women is increasing, right, still it's more men in general that are incarcerated in this country than women. And so every sort of response reform tends to err in that direction or lean in that direction of addressing the incarceration of men as opposed to women. And the DVSJ, we sort of flip that on its head. The DVSJ applies to people of all genders, right? It's not only for women that you can seek a sentence reduction. And we've had some men now obtain sentence reductions through the act. But again, the spirit of it, the notion that we just weren't talking about the kinds of things that happen to women that led to their involvement in the criminal legal system, that's something we see repeated over and over and over again. So our core group are formerly incarcerated women who understand also that it's not just a question, right? When you say domestic violence and the criminal legal system, the thing that comes to mind is of someone who fights back self-defense against an abuser, against someone who is hurting them. But the thing is that this goes so much deeper than that. That is not the only type of situation we're seeing. We're seeing where someone's abusive family member or partner coerces them to become involved in a criminal offense. We see it in drug offenses, robberies, conspiracies, right? So it's not just self-defense and what people talk about more traditionally as the battered women's syndrome. It is about how exploitation and abuse impact someone and lead to criminal legal system involvement beyond just fighting back in the moment. And obviously, I will say it again, it applies to people of all genders, but because the energy and organizing in New York at least came from inside our women's prisons, that is where we began our work with implementation of the law.
And I really do have to commend you for how many people you reached out to make sure that you were doing what they needed with regard to this law. Lawanda?
I'm sitting here, I'm listening to Kate, but I'm also looking at the cat. The chat box. I'm sorry. Is it possible, Alex, that you could address that? Because Warren and I were juveniles, because Kate is representing the victims or domestic violence. Could you explain exactly what second look is all about? It is not just for Black people, not just for women. Could you please just touch on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's what we've been working on in Michigan, Wanda, right?
Okay, yes.
You sat at that table for 8 hours with us while we had these very long and in-depth discussions about what we were going to do to offer people what we consider to be a genuine second look, right? And we had, as you put it, Kate, just sort of this great mix of people who are researchers, who are lawyers, and people who will actually rely on this mechanism. And so I'll just speak to Michigan, Lawanda. The law that we're currently working on and seeking would allow a person to apply to their sentencing judge to be resentenced. They would be permitted to do this after 10 years if the commission of their offense happened under the age of 25, and 15 years if the commission of their offense was over the age of 25. And we've been very specific about the protections of women and their specific trauma in the things that we're asking a potential judge to consider. We've been very specific about people who suffer from physical and mental illness that would make them unable to meet a great majority of standards that have been suggested. And we've been very specific about allowing Warren, as you shared with us and shared with our coalition, and Kate, as you and Eric have both said very well, to look at the whole human. Not just anything that's been put on record by the DOC, but actually who this person has become in the face of what happened initially and what has happened while they're incarcerated. So from the sentencing project angle, that's what we're seeking in all of the second look bills that we're supporting. But of course, we also support bills like DVSJA, any bill that serves as sort of that wedge when it comes to extreme sentencing. Kate, I see you got something.
I just want to jump in to sort of draw a comparison also between the bill that we have on the books that we are now utilizing and what we're hoping to pass in New York. And what we're hoping to pass in New York is a true second look act, which would apply, right, not just to domestic violence survivors, but to anyone. And like Alex just said, it would allow judges to review a sentence after 10 years, after someone has served 10 years. It has some exclusions, but what's interesting about the way it's drafted right now is it also says that you can get around those exclusions if the prosecutor consents. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it's starting to create that pathway of opening up beyond just the traditional exclusions. It creates a presumption of resentencing for people whose offense was committed when they were younger than 25 or are now over 55. So there's sort of, right, that age.
Ours too, yeah.
Built in. It guarantees representation. So it gives people lawyers to go through this process. And our bill says the case will be heard by a different judge than the judge that initially sentenced you. And there are, I think, different schools of thought on that and different ways to approach that. But that is another huge obstacle that we talk about, right? When we are going back in front of the same judges that handed down some of these very, very long sentences. How do you get at them? How is this not you did something wrong, because judges never do anything wrong, but rather look how far we've come. All of us, let's bring you along.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Warren, actually, you and I were having a conversation just a little bit earlier about what you experienced with, I guess, what is a federally appointed judge, obviously, because of the way DC Superior Court works, and what it is that they took into consideration. Do you feel that the experience that you had was as fair as it could be, given the general issues that we face within our criminal legal system in terms of prejudice, et cetera?
I truly believe the way the bill is written, it gives those the best opportunity for release, but I still trust that it could be supplements added, because as time progresses, you see certain things that can be tweaked a little bit, because, doing long sentences, individuals get tired of doing time and they file IPA motions and things of that nature. They judge, I didn't do it, things of that nature. But this is normal behavior. Certain experts that spoke on this type of behavior, being regular on the inside, but outside of little things like that, which is more so major in the eyes of a judge, I say that, just supplementing the bill with certain things that's almost unavoidable in prison. If, I'm an individual coming up for a second look, and I've filed an IPA motion, and I actually went through with the process, that gives the judge, a little leverage to say, well, you lied about this. Well, you have to be honorable in that time and say, well, judge, I was thinking about dying in prison, and I didn't want to die in prison. At this point, I almost do anything just to get out of prison. And certain judges in Washington, D.C. respected that. I'm an individual who filed the IPA motion. I know other individuals who filed these motions. And the judges still looked at, again, the mitigating circumstances, the person that you became, and did you take the initiative while you was on the inside to make yourself whole again? Also, certain things that Alex mentioned about individuals having mental problems that, doesn't allow them, to perform as such in these type of environments. The judges took that consideration as well. You have individuals who didn't have GEDs due to mental impediments, who, was more violent with them just because, the way they was raised and the environments that they were in. And these certain individuals have been released as well and flourishing out here in society. But ultimately, that's some of the things that the judges approached here in the nation's capital, as far as Iowa.
Absolutely. Eric, when it comes to how youth are approached when it comes to offenses, and we know that when people are young and they are caught up in this system, that even if they are released from that state at a younger age, very frequently they are not helped to the next step. What do you say when you hear what I'm sure is the inevitable argument of, if you start young, you're going to continue this way, that people can't change? We even say that about children.
Well, I'll say they're wrong, because I was one of those, individuals. I was also a 17-year-old, high school kid at the time of my sentencing. And, I was sentenced to, 2 25-year sentences. During that time, I educated myself, and, I've been home now for 18 years. So when I hear people say that children cannot change, I am co-founder of the ICANN network, the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. And out of the 800 plus children that have been released, 200 plus of those children are active within my network, which demonstrates that individuals are coming home. And not only are they asserting themselves to their communities, but they're becoming very strong pillars of their communities. Mothers are seeing sons returning home, and young boys and girls in the community. As we mentioned, that are seeing, growing up without seeing dads, brothers, or uncles, are seeing those men and women return to their communities and reclaim their rightful place at head of family. So again, I say that they are wrong. I represent the children who have changed, and the many more to come home that will change.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to a conversation that I think is very difficult in this work when it comes to second chances, which is the narrative that we see generally in the public about crime rates, about danger, about who, again, which communities are covered, which are not, how they're covered. So Eric, I'll turn back to you quickly. In terms of the narrative that we're seeing, just sort of broadly in the general public, and even particularly about the way we're highlighting young people who commit offenses. What would you like to see change there?
Well, one of the things that I would like to see change is, the narrative. I'm aware that members of society want to know that they and their families are safe. They want to know that the right people are returning to their communities. As I mentioned earlier, over 800 plus, individuals who were tried as adults and sentenced to die in prison are now home, investing themselves in their communities. So what I would like to see change is the narrative around this. These individuals are actually coming home being model citizens. They are not threat to society. The narrative is that these individuals continue to be monsters and they continue to be a threat, someone that anyone doesn't want to be a neighbor. That has to change. The over 800 people are demonstrating that they are viable citizens, and more of this narrative should be shared in order to change this. So if there's one change, it's a narrative shift.
Absolutely. LaWanda, do you want to jump in on this one? I see you nodding there.
Yes, and I always say this, there are only two things that can happen once you've been incarcerated. You will either die in prison or you will be released. Those are the only two things that can happen. And if I am going to be released, what is it you want me to do? You want me to go on and be successful. You want me to regain status or gain status in some situations in the community. You want me to be a part of that community, which is what I really try to talk about, is the re-entry and getting rid of those barriers and things like that. Coming home, I didn't know how to use the telephone. The stove started ticking. I'm like, I'm about to blow up the block. And it's like, you want those things to not be there. You want me to serve my time and do as you have asked. And once I've done that, when I re-enter into society, you can't make it hard. You have to, as Eric has said, change the narrative on that. You can't just keep on with, she did this 50 years ago. So that is my point. Once we gain the second chance and we come back, we have to be able to move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we need to be brave in how we step forward and try to step forward in the largest ways possible, because we got ourselves into this situation with very large bills that had very large impact. And here at the Sentencing Project, at least, we believe in large bills that have large impact, because we know we're going to get whittled down, but we have so many people to help. But within movement, there is also a thought process of ask for the smallest, least offensive thing. And hopefully we can take baby steps forward. And those two mindsets and sort of all that exists in between them is, I think, a major question in this work. How do we approach relief? Now, Eric, you guys go for the full repeal, right? You go for the full thing. Why is that your approach?
It's our approach because there's brain science that backs our work. There's brain science that states that children are less culpable than adults. That children should be treated and tried differently than adults. So we ask wholesale that children be taken out of the situations where they face life without parole and given a second opportunity. Warren said it best. Children face the worst penalty because if they go in the system at 14, 15, 16 years old, they can serve upwards of 60 plus years in prison. There's no adult that can go in prison and survive that long. Their bodies will not carry them that long. So, children receive the stiffest penalty. So we ask wholesale that children receive age appropriate sentences.
Absolutely. Kate, with the DVSJA law, you all also went in wholesale. You, of course, had to negotiate, and this, you fought for many, many years to stay away from exclusions. Why was that your approach, as opposed to asking for something far more narrow and perhaps in some cases to some people less offensive?
Because it was the right thing to do. Right? Because you talk about being brave enough. I mean, I hate that it has to be bravery to just say what we're doing is wrong. But that's it. And also because this effort was started on the inside, there were people that were looking at other people that would be excluded if the law were narrowly written, right? They were sitting down with people and saying, oh, your charge, right? You wouldn't be in this then. And that was impossible for people to stomach. Now we did land there because 10 years of going back to our state capital year after year after year. But I think that's part of it. And I think so much has to be done to make clear how harmful incarceration is. As a starting point, I mean, people don't get, we can talk, right? We get a little bit more traction when we talk about young people, or we talk about people who've experienced domestic violence, but we're still just not talking about how harmful incarceration is. And the trauma that comes, right? So we're talking about trauma before people are arrested and brought into the system. We're talking about the trauma of prosecution, and then the trauma of long-term incarceration. So one of the things the Survivors Justice Project is working on right now, and I'd welcome input from folks and more discussion on this. Our support services coordinator is designing a curriculum on the trauma of incarceration, right? Even for people who are in courts every single day, there's still sort of this divorced way of understanding what happens after sentence. And I think if we really do expose that, then we will shift, we'll move away. There's no way that you can think about that, understand it, reckon with it, interact with it, and then still support sending someone to prison for life, for 60 years, for 50, for 40 years. I mean, let's keep going. And I will just say that when we're always pushing. So if we're working to end life without sentences for young people, for adults, we can't just then have it be that people are sentenced to indeterminate sentences and become parole eligible and are never granted parole. An effective life sentence, even if it's not a life sentence on the books. So then the part of the organizing and the steps that we must take are addressing what comes next.
Absolutely. Warren, you and I have had this discussion many times, and you've pushed me on this many times around your feelings about why we shouldn't exclude anyone, why all ages should be considered in these bills. As we've sort of navigated various negotiations, you're somebody who is a recipient of a bill that was age locked, right? Why do you take that additional step?
To piggyback off what Eric said, I think he answered it greatly. When he spoke of the experience and the data. I mean, just having the experience of what I went through, that gives me the notoriety. Also the data to back up what I went through. That gives me my voice. That gives me my motivation. That gives me my drive. No matter who opposes, respectfully. I think the system is very adversarial. And it creates, these systems where it's us against them. I think we need healthy restorative justice measures, that can help bridge the gap. Because I know how hard it is to lose a loved one. Me being an individual who was involved with the murder, wasn't the trigger man, but I was involved. But I have lost loved ones as well. So I've been on both sides of the spectrum. To receive this second look just speaks volumes, not to only what I've been through, but the future of what can possibly happen for those who's coming behind me. But to more so answer your question, I just trust that if the things that you're speaking on have ground, just have the correct support and things of that nature, you should more so be fearless in your approach, and never think that things are so bad that they can't get better. You just have to, dig deep, join forces with individuals who have, like qualities. And I also believe to educate the public on CJR laws. The public need to be educated on CJR laws. It shouldn't be that because individuals are returning home from prison in an alarming rate, this is the reason for murder going up. This is the reason for carjacking going up. It shouldn't be that when the numbers don't suggest that. These people have been less informed, and they speaking on certain things they don't know. So I trust and believe if the public was more educated, they understand the significance of a second look.
Absolutely. Lawanda, I want to turn to you because, Kate, Eric, and Warren, you've all said something that I consider to be very significant that I think people don't think about, right? Which is the trauma in prison. We are asking people to prove their worthiness of a second chance in any of these mechanisms through indescribably terrible situations. And you've spoken out as a member of Nation Outside at the Second Look rally in Lansing, Michigan, about the terrible experiences that you have. What do you think we need to be taking into consideration or pinpointing when we're talking to the people who are going to be making these decisions about what you're actually up against when they tell you to do these things, better yourself, get an education, and in terrible circumstances? What do people really need to know?
When you enter prison, they tell you to prepare to leave prison, which means they want you to participate in these programs. They want you to do this and they want you to do that. And you can't do that. That's unrealistic. The only thing you learn in prison is how to survive in prison. That is it. That is all.
And that's assuming programming is offered to you at all, which for many long sentences, it's not.
Yes, I was about to add that. And I just really don't like to tell people this because, I'm trying to survive out here. But in the last few months of my incarceration, they allowed me to take the cooking class. So technically, I am considered a chef. However, I can't cut an onion because they ain't gave me no knife in prison. So they hurry up and push me through this program and said, you're a chef. You know at what temperature the meat is supposed to be, how long you're supposed to cook it. And my first job, the one thing they wanted me to do was cut an onion. I don't have no knife skills. Them people ain't gave me no knife to do nothing with. So
even the programming we're offering
yes,
is completely off.
so that's like, it's unrealistic. And I want people to know that. And I also believe this, and I'm sure that y'all may have some statistics behind it, but in layman's world, people think that they're spending their tax dollars on rehabilitation. That's not true. They're spending your tax dollars on punishment.
Yes.
And if you ask me or my neighbors or anybody, because I've tested this, if you wanted to, if you knew you were spending your money on punishment, on housing of people in prison, would you be paying for that? Would you be paying for that? And they're like, no, we're not. We want to pay for rehabilitation. That's not what's happening. That's not what's happening.
That is one of the most powerful things. The only thing you learn in prison is how to survive in prison.
Absolutely.
Eric,
Absolutely.
I saw you unmute yourself there for a second. It looked like you were about ready to jump in. Is that comment still fresh in your mind?
Well, they made several statements that brought things to mind. When we go in so young, I don't think society realizes that there's only one way that you can grow. And we don't talk about this, especially as men. And I'm pretty sure the women experience the same thing, but we're not able to grow up emotionally. I went in at 17, I came home at 28, and I was so much of a 17-year-old emotionally that, I didn't realize that, for almost 11 years, I had never cried. I had never tapped into the depth of my emotion. So, not only did they incarcerate me, they kept me from being fully a human. And, that's what incarceration does, to individuals. It blocks you from experiencing the full depths of your humanness. And, hearing those two talk, made me think of that. I was fortunate because, I had a term of year sentence. For my co-defendant and others who had life, they could not participate in GED classes like I did. I became a licensed barber, but I had to watch other children grow up and just, pretty much go to the wayside because they were deemed as, less fortunate. They were deemed as throwaway individuals that, their lives were not worthy of, being educated and given that second chance. So, hearing them talk, brought up that range of emotions. It made me realize that, I spent a great deal of my free time. I've been home for 18 years. And I say another 10 of that has been tapping into my emotional being.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Eric. That's just really powerful. And I think that's something that everybody needs to hear. And, I think as a society, we probably need to start tapping into our emotions around compassion and empathy and understanding of a multitude of things that would make us a much, much better world. Well, in our last 2 minutes before we move to the question section, so that everybody will get to ask questions of our amazing panelists, in honor of Second Chance Month, if you could just make a closing statement about second chances, why they matter to you, and why you maintain hope despite the obstacles that you all run at. Kate, I'll start with you.
This is the one I really didn't want to go first, but because it's a real question. Like, what is a second chance? I see in the chat someone already has raised, like, was there a first chance? And I don't want to come across or be dismissive of the fact that we are talking also about harm. We're talking about harm in like 360 degrees of harm. Right? We're talking about having caused harm in some way to someone or something. We're talking about having experienced harm. We're talking about the harm of incarceration. So all this is about harm. And I just see us as chipping away at that harm. And then also recognizing that what people need, I mean, to Eric's last point, to Lawanda's last point, like healing is a thing. But it's not a thing in our criminal legal system, but it is a thing. And so, that you can't put a sentence number on healing for someone on the, like someone who has experienced the harm of having a loved one taken away or a loved one hurt, being hurt themselves. And so thinking about that, like, so what keeps me going is having beautiful conversations like this, where we're honest, and taking this to our respective jurisdictions. I mean, I see in the chat how many people are talking about the efforts they're doing in their home states, home counties, home cities. And then also there's just a certain beauty about being able to have these ideas and think about, again, to Eric's point, when you come home, and Luanda's been saying this since the beginning of our conversation, what do you actually need? You don't need to say that you're a chef when you don't know how to use a knife, but you do need something. And it's on us to provide that something for our communities, for each other. For a long time in my legal career, I was a lawyer representing people that had just been arrested. So right at the point of initial prosecution. And that was a particular time, a moment in time for them. And a lot of stress and anxiety and fear happening at that time. Now, over the last few years, as we've shifted our focus in the clinic, particularly to working with people who are the long-termers, right, who have been in for a number of years, there's just so much pain, but there's also so much beauty and healing that comes about just from our human relationships. So even when we can't get a court to resentence someone, and even when the parole board denies someone again, right, we are with each other. We are building community and network. And so that's what keeps me going.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kate. Lawanda, what keeps you going, even though I know you're a firebrand, in the street all day, every day?
Alex, I was really hoping that you didn't call on me next.
I seem to be going all out of order here, but I'm gonna pick on you anyway.
What keeps me going is my victims. I've been granted a second chance, and I would not want to get out here and misuse it. What I did when I did what I did, I was wrong. I didn't feel I had any other choice. That was the decision that I made. I harmed a whole host of people by that one decision. And this second chance allows me to move forward, and I would never want to misuse that. And that is what keeps me going.
Thank you for sharing that, Lawanda. And you always make me cry, like every coalition meeting, like you really have to stop. Eric, what keeps you going?
There are a couple of things that keep me going. Hearing from individuals like Warren and Lawanda and members of our ICANN network who are home. Continue to change the narrative, give me hope, as well as calls to our office from bipartisan lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, saying that we understand our state has not abolished jail for children, but we're willing to give it a shot. That gives me hope that states are continuing to grapple with the issue until we get resolved.
Thank you for that, Eric. Warren, what keeps you going? What gives you hope?
I just truly believe that it's not enough hours in the day, to talk about, important topics like, the one that we're on now. Just every time someone else speaks, more things go through my mind about what's not being said. But ultimately, that's what keeps me going, to say the things that's not being said each and every single day, and as long as I live, to advocate, be a general of change. Because I was actually deemed Mr. Can't Get Right, and for individuals to see me now, it's like a rude awakening, truthfully. I'm still in contact, not only with social workers, therapists, but with judges and all, that constantly check on me, amazed by how I'm doing the things of that nature. So that's extra motivation as well. human beings are not above fault. We all make mistakes. And you can be Miss Goody Two Shoes. But if you make a mistake, you will want a second chance, maybe a third chance, maybe a fourth and fifth chance. I advocate for second chances, but I believe there should be more because we're not above fault. Things happen. I went to prison when I was 17 years old. I'm now 39 years of age. And I can say the things that I knew then. I definitely, and I'm getting emotional. The things that I was experiencing then, can't believe I'm here to tell it. But however, I've grown. I'm more modest. And I'm more intentional, with my behavior. Because it's not just about me. It's about the other men and women who serving long sentences that's deserving of a second chance like myself. There's so much more I could say, but I end with that.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you to all of you for sharing your struggles in this fight, for sharing your personal struggles, your personal growth, and for maintaining the hope in this work. It is one of the greatest challenges. So I'm going to turn to questions that have been sent to me for you all. So we can all just jump in at this portion. I'm going to stop playing school teacher. So somebody said, I'm curious what the opposition has been towards getting these bills passed, and if there have been creative ways you've used to gain support and momentum for passage. So feel free to jump on in. And it doesn't just have to be bills. Any creative ways you've moved the conversation forward, I'll add that there as well. What was that, LaWanda? You're muted.
That's a good one for you.
I'm just moderating on this one. But I always love running campaigns with you. Eric, I see you.
Yeah. I'll say that one of the things that has worked for us is showing legislators our map of the 25 states that have already banned the practice of death by incarceration and the other 6 that have no child serving such a sentence. We share that this change in policy has resulted in the release of over 800 individuals, showing that other states felt that this group posed no threat to public safety. And in fact, that these folks, who are home are contributing meaningfully to their communities. More important, we make them proximate to those most impacted by the issue by introducing them to members of our incarcerated children's advocacy network. Hearing the stories of redemption, seeing the talent that has been restored to their districts and the hope that it gives to those still serving helps them to connect the issue with their personal faith traditions, business, and other community interests.
Absolutely. Kate, I thought you were about to jump in there. Good.
Yeah, I think Eric's point is a really good one, which is that showing almost in like facilitating a kind of competition among states, right? You don't want to be the worst on this. So, and then getting, how do you get people to care about anything? You have to figure out the way to connect with them. And so we've been doing a lot of work in New York with video and film to tell stories. And we've been fortunate, although as soon as I say it, I'm like, oh, I'm jinxing I can't say it, in that our prisons have let us come in with cameras and video to actually do some collaborative artistic work with folks, to tell experiences, to share experiences. It is one thing to look at a fact sheet full of statistics. It is a very different thing to look at and hear from someone. I mean, I think you're all experiencing it right now with hearing from people. The emotion, the sense you get of someone, the fact that it becomes much more difficult to disregard that person as a human being. So how do we do that? We keep trying to introduce those connections for people in positions of power. We get that stuff in judges' trainings so that we avoid these sentences from the outset, right? So that we're really thinking about this stuff from the beginning, as opposed to just constantly trying to free and liberate folks many years later. So I think there are a bunch of different ways to do that. And certainly it has seemed to work to move it beyond just words on a paper.
Absolutely. And this question is sort of in the same kind of tenor. And somebody said very funny that it's that trying to change the narrative around tough on crime is like trying to turn the Queen Mary around in a bathtub. But you all seem to be at the helm of the Queen Mary in that tub, and you know, are trying to take that sharp turn. So when you hear the classic, I'm a legislator, I'm a person who believes in the, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime narrative, what do you say to them? I think everybody thinking about like, you know, knocking their coffee into their lap right now. But once we're past that.
No, I just heard Warren's big sigh after that question was asked.
Yeah, I just say that, I'm opposed to that theory, because I think that validates why they incarcerate. If you do the time, you have to do the crime. That gives them a slogan, that perpetuates more individuals going to prison. So that being said, poverty is a direct link to homelessness and prison. And then your reward is incarceration. So it's sad. It's sad. For me being an individual, who comes from a fatherless household, and many of my friends came from fatherless households as well, as the narrative says, hurt people hurt people. And that's what we did. Unintentionally, uncognitively, but however, it happened. And the best thing I could do now is replenish my community, and give other youth, hopeful measures to cling on to, rather than the ones that's being presented in our environment.
Wholesale narrative rejection. That's why I like working with you, Warren. LaWanda, I saw you on mute as well.
Well, I like to always, and it's been hard, but I've learned it. I'm 53 now. So I like for people to be their truest self. And once you've formed an opinion, I like to let you keep it unless it needs to be changed. And so when you have come up with the, if you can't do the jail time, don't do the crime type of mentality, then I like to invite people to these types of events so that you can understand this that's untrue and that needs to be changed in order for us to go forward. Mm-hmm. So that's an untruth. That's an untruth. The only thing that really keeps us going is hope. I hope it's going to be different today. Well, because it's a many a times that any of us could have taken our own lives. We could have been killed. Anything could have happened in that environment.
Yeah.
But it's hope. And everybody, to society or whatever, everybody wants to be on the front, the cutting edge of what's going on, what's happening. And this is what it is. This is the truth.
Yep. Absolutely.
For those who say don't do the crime if you can't do the time, I will point to the sentencing disparities across districts and, show them how, African Americans are, sentenced disproportionately, to other races, and tell them that when they make sentences fair, then make the statement, don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
Yeah, when all else is equal, we can have that discussion. And up until that point, that one does not work at all. Wholesale rejection, just like Warren said. Kate?
Yeah, that's such a critical point, right? That implies some sort of fairness or reason to this that we know just doesn't exist. So highlighting that, and then also thinking about who's in position of power and where leadership is and who needs to be in those positions. And so it's very easy to other and dismiss, right? When this has not been your life experience, your life has not been impacted by this, your family, has not been impacted. But the more that people engage, right, it changes. I have to believe it changes. Lawanda talks about hope, right? Like, I mean, that is the hope. And so, for example, in New York State right now, we have our first state legislator who is formerly incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine, I happen to know, right, having seen his work already, his position on this stuff is going to be very different from an elected official who has never been inside a prison, let alone as a person serving a sentence.
In Washington, D.C., Warren's friend Joel Caston ran for office while he was currently incarcerated to represent the prison here in D.C. I mean, and is already making a huge impact. But I just want to get through a few more questions because people, want responses from you. So while many states do not yet have full-blown second look laws as NACDL sort of defines them, somebody wants to know, do second look laws only apply to individuals who admit guilt or regret? What about individuals who've expressed their innocence or who were wrongfully convicted? And I think this is something very important to include in these bills. And even the innocence route is fraught with all sorts of bumps, as every process for release has been. But Kate, in DVSJA, how has this been working?
Oh, well, honestly. But Warren spoke about this earlier, right, in the second look, in talking about people who have filed motions before challenging their convictions on various grounds and how that's interpreted. And I was interested to hear that Warren's experience was one where that didn't act as an obstacle or a barrier. What we've seen in New York is that for people who went to trial, for people who have filed any sort of motion contesting their conviction, even if they're not saying that they are innocent, but just any kind of motion challenging their conviction, that is interpreted by a court later on as a refusal to accept responsibility. The parole board does that as well. So courts and the parole board all do that.
Yeah.
So we are in a little bit of a bind for people who, there's different categories of people's experience, right? There's an experience where people are convicted of things they simply did not do.
Right.
We understand that. Innocence projects and sort of wrongful conviction work across the country has shown us that. There's also a category of people who are convicted of something, but that something doesn't really align with what actually happened. Right? And it's not the same as an actual innocence, right? DNA is not going to come in and show that someone else did it. It's just that the way it went down during the initial prosecution doesn't line up with what actually happened. Mm-hmm. That is much more common. Mm-hmm. And plea bargaining, for example, you plead to something, but that's not what actually lines up with the circumstances. And so that sets up a situation where people are forced to take a position that may not comport with what actually happened.
So you're asking for a second look on something that didn't actually happen and being asked to speak to your guilt 50 years later on something that was not the situation. Yeah.
What we've seen is courts tend to treat this then as a second trial in some ways, as opposed to what it should be, which is a look at someone's sentence and whether the sentence needs to change. And that is, we run into a lot of difficulty and opposition there. And so I would love to see that kind of built in, that this is not a second trial.
Yes, absolutely.
Show whether someone committed an offense, didn't commit an offense, but this is really about the sentence at this point.
Yeah. So we are almost out of time. So I'm going to end with one last question, which I think is a very big one and a massive part of the narrative is what role, if any, should accountability towards victims/survivors play in making second look decisions? And I think that this is a real sort of linchpin in a lot of these laws. Jump in.
That's actually a great question because survivors of crimes are not monolithic. We work with survivors, on, majority of the reforms that, we work on in states. And, we have those survivors that come forward and say that they would like the person who offended them or, one of their loved ones to receive a second chance. Survivors believe in redemption. Again, they are not monolithic, and this should be known, widely. Prosecutors, misuse their voices often.
I could not agree more as a survivor. Who else? Anybody else want to jump in here? Well, we are a minute. Oh, sorry, Warren, go ahead.
No. In short, I just think that the prosecutor, finds leverage in one's case and they utilize it to the best of their ability. So, if you do have a victim family, member or members, and in attendance, you know, the prosecutor does his best to more so exploit that, you know, and ways to make sure you don't get a second look. So I just believe that the way that the system is set up, we have to, you know, dig deeper, you know, and just try to be more, you know, more of a body, you know, of more of a us thing and not like an I or he thing,
Absolutely.
you know, it's more of a us thing. So to collaborate, you know, with prosecutors on things such as this, you know, be monumental for the future of Second Look.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Monica, I will hand this back over to you, but I would like to thank every single one of you for coming to this panel, for sharing your expertise, for sharing your stories, for the movement that you've clearly caused within our audience, and for your belief in second chances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I just concur with your thanks to you also just for moderating the conversation, for our panelists for sharing their experiences, either personal experience or in the states that they've been engaged in. So definitely a lot of conversation on the chat. And I will say in terms of some reoccurring questions, so yes, it's being recorded and we will share it with everyone. It'll be made publicly available on our website, and everyone who registered will be notified when the recording is available. There's a lot of questions. I know there's a lot of interest in this subject area, so that's why we're sharing our panelists' contact information. So feel free to continue the conversation if you have anything specific. Some people, even the Q&A, ask how they can get involved. So I think actually I might turn it back to you, Alex, in terms of, and some of the other panelists in terms of how they can get involved in your organization's work. I would say from us at NACDL, there's definitely resources that have been shared throughout the chat, and we'll continue to share them even after the webinar. We do have a model second look policy that's really expansive. It includes no carve-outs, it applies to everyone, regardless of age. And it requires a second look after 10 years. And so we're actively engaged in a number of states, obviously working in coalition even with Alex in the Michigan policy and the bills that will soon to be introduced. Another question that came up, so not introduced yet, but will soon to be introduced. So we are definitely a ready available partner at the state level. Again, we work with other sort of national and state organizations on this issue as well. So again, we encourage you to reach out to the panelists. You can reach out to us here at NACDL as well to continue the conversation. And again, apologizing not be able to get to all the questions. It was definitely a robust conversation that was going on in the chat, but I hope you guys gleaned something from this conversation. If we can sort of put up the survey slide as well. Obviously, we want to hear your thoughts about even the programming content and any other programming around this or any other issues related to criminal justice that you would like to see sort of a policy conversations on. So we encourage you to fill out the survey and just tell us your thoughts on this programming as well as future programming. As I alluded to, this is sort of the second in our sort of series of Second Chance Month programming. So I hope you guys will join us even next week, and we'll round out our sort of Second Chance Month programming with a conversation around jury diversity and the impact that felony disenfranchisement laws has on this. And I'm excited to be that my colleague, Monica Milton, who's our public defense counsel, will be moderating that conversation amongst, as well as some other experts on the topic of juries and diversity. So again, we thank you, we thank the panelists, and we thank everyone who has joined us and stick with us for this 90-minute conversation. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.